In this video, we're going to be talking about the New Kingdom in ancient Egypt. Uh, if you are remembering, we've already talked about the Old and the Middle Kingdoms, and also a reminder that these are divisions that modern day historians have placed on ancient Egypt based off of certain themes. We said that the theme in the Old Kingdom was that they built the pyramids. The New Kingdom, or the Middle Kingdom, was characterized by the rise of the Hyksos, an outside group, a different ethnic group from ethnic Egyptians who came to power during the Middle Kingdom, who were eventually overthrown. And that leads us to the New Kingdom, the more modern or more recent division of ancient Egypt. And as you can just see from this map, Egypt looks a little bit different than the last time we looked at it. It certainly has a lot more land, as you can see, and this is the height of what we might call the Egyptian territory. So let's dive into some of the characteristics of the New Kingdom and talk about actually some names that you've probably heard before, which should be at least theoretically exciting for us here. So after many years of rebuilding, after the rise of power and the overthrow of the Hyksos, um, Egypt starts conquering other territories. So we saw in the Middle Kingdom, they started expanding down into Nubia, right, farther south into Nubia. Um, but they kept expanding even more, right? They went even farther during this new period of conquering. Also, a big deal is they left the Nile River, right? As you can see, really for the first time, the ancient Egyptians spread out into the Sinai Peninsula. That's at the top of the Red Sea there, and also up along the coast of the Levant region, right? Basically, taking half of the Fertile Crescent, right? The Mesopotamian region there. So all along right in the land of Canaan. So this is a really big shift for ancient Egypt, right? This is a lot more territory than what they were used to, and again, expanding outside of just the Nile River and the Nile Delta. So this is a major shift. And the real question that I have for you guys is why? Why would they start expanding now? And I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to think about this, or I'm going to ask that you maybe pause this video and think about the answer to this question, right? Why did the ancient Egyptians start conquering lands after the Middle Kingdom? So hopefully you've thought about this. You've maybe hit pause. The answer, really, from my perspective, is that they are trying to prevent themselves from being conquered again, right? That one of the ways that you can prevent outsiders like the Hyksos from coming in and taking power is to have more territory, right? So that they would have to essentially fight their way through more of your land to get to kind of the heart of your culture or the capital cities that you might have. So uh, that's one of the reasons why Egypt starts expanding, right? They expand not just around the Nile River, but also up and along the Mediterranean, right? That you see this expansion of Egyptian territory because they're trying to prevent outsiders from coming in and conquering them again. Um, as we'll see, that's not very successful in the long term. Spoiler alert. But this is a pretty rational thing, right? There's only a few ways that you can get to Egypt, right, or the Nile River, right. One is to access it from the Mediterranean. The other is to go from Libya, right, from the Sahara Desert and going in there. There's not many people over there, so there's not much of a threat. You have the Red Sea on the one side, which makes it pretty difficult to cross. And so, really, the only place that Egypt has to worry about getting conquered from is, from what we would call today the Middle East, right? The Palestinian lands, the Canaan lands, where Israel is today. The Levant region, if you will. So that region becomes really important for the Egyptians to conquer. And you can even see that there's a marker there for the Hittite Empire. We know that they had a major battle at the battle site Kadesh, which is labeled on this map, against the Hittites, right? But you can see that this is a pretty, big expansion of Egyptian territory. And a lot of that has to do with their concern and anxiety about being taken over. And with this comes the rise of the great pharaohs, right? Names that you might have heard before. Um, the first one that we'll mention is Thutmose. Maybe you've seen this name before. A lot of you might have called him Thutmose. It's not Thutmose, it's Thutmose. He conquers the land of Palestine, which is modern day Israel, which is up where it says Megiddo, right around there. Um, Also, his descendant Thutmose III conquered all the way up to the Euphrates River, which is above Kadesh there on the map. You can see that it conquers some of the river there. That's the Euphrates River, as in the Tigris and Euphrates River. Thutmose III gave Egypt its largest territory ever, right? This was the height of the Egyptian empire. That they're no longer just, a combination of lower and upper Egypt that then, has its own culture and stuff. It actually is a full-fledged empire. Um, and really to compete with the other great empires of the region, right? The Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and of course the Hittite Empire. So this is a pretty big deal, right? That Thutmose the third conquers all this land. And a name that we certainly have to talk about, a name that you've either read about already or are going to be reading more about, is the name Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut is an extremely important figure in ancient Egyptian history and an extremely important figure for our understanding of the ancient world as well, because Hatshepsut was a woman. She is probably not the first female pharaoh, but the first that we have evidence of. Hatshepsut reigned for a little over 20 years. What we think happened is she would have originally been a regent, which is the fancy word for a stand-in. So you can imagine that if the pharaoh dies, or in fact this happens in modern day monarchies as well, where the king or queen dies, and the heir, the next person in line to the throne, is a child, right? You don't really want, especially in ancient Egypt where that person's a god, you don't really want that person to be, like a 2-year-old and whatever they say is, going to happen and stuff. So they usually had an older relative, usually their mother actually, be a stand-in or a regent, who then just kind of was like a placeholder until the kid was old enough, right? Kind of like a stand-in or a substitute. But the difference with Hatshepsut, and that had happened many, many times in Egyptian history, right? More times than we can count, that there would have been a regent that would have stood in until the child was old enough, or until an heir was decided, right? We talked before about there being conflict among the children of a pharaoh. So Hatshepsut, as a woman, right, that's not unheard of that she would have been the regent. But what is unheard of is that she said, no, I'm not a regent. I'm actually pharaoh myself. She was the daughter of a pharaoh, right? Remember, the Egyptians, at least the pharaohs, were very incestuous, right? So her brother was also, her brother was a pharaoh. She was pharaoh, his wife. He dies. Her son, Thutmose III, was too young to become pharaoh, so she stepped into his place, into the place of the regent, and then just declared herself pharaoh and ruled for 20 years. It's a long time. It's a really long time. And what's interesting in ancient Egypt is, and you might be confused about some of these things here, both of these statues on the screen here are of Hatshepsut. Even though the one on the more clear picture looks male, right? That's the traditional way pharaohs look. And that's because she made sure to always depict herself as a male image, because again, in ancient Egypt, a pharaoh was a masculine thing, right? It was a title. They didn't have the title for a queen. It was just pharaoh, and it was always masculine. So it would be like if there was no word for queen, it was just king. So in order to be king, or in this case pharaoh, she had to adopt, at least in official portraits, a male image, right? So she had the false beard that she would wear. Now, interestingly enough, we'll get more into this with symbolism a little bit later, but that beard that they wear, all of them wore it as fake. None of them actually grew a beard like that. That was symbolic, right? In fact, they usually tied it on around their ears. when they had to like do ceremonial things, right? Right, that beard is the symbol of a pharaoh. She also called herself the son of Amun Ra or Amun Re. Um, Amun, either one is fine. Amun Ra was, the main god of the Egyptian pantheon, right? He was the combination of the god of the gods and the sun, right? A combination that happened over time in Egyptian mythology. And she said that she was the son of him, right? So again, using these masculine terms because pharaohs had to be masculine. But make no mistake about it, she was a woman. She was absolutely just as important and ruled just as well as all the other men that have ruled. In fact, she even conquered a lot of land. The land of Punt, which is a little bit farther south along the Nile, in Nubia, she led the military expedition to conquer that land. Right? Was it a way to say that she was, just as strong as a male pharaoh? Possibly. But either way, right? We have an instance of a woman, really the first instance in recorded history that we have of a woman taking the reins of a major civilization in the ancient world, right? This is a big deal that you have women in these positions of power, right? Women were regents fairly frequently, and here you have the first instance of a female pharaoh. Right, this is also going to be foreshadowing when we talk about probably the most famous female pharaoh, Cleopatra. Right, this another female pharaoh that it became more commonplace later than it would have initially. So that's Hatshepsut. Her son, after her death, finally becomes pharaoh. Right, there's some historical records of some infighting. Right, he was probably not that happy that his mother became pharaoh instead of him and ruled for 20 years while he was just waiting in the wings. But eventually he got his shot and ruled for a while. And Thutmose III, as we saw in that last slide, expanded Egypt to its largest territory, right? Conquered all the way up to the Euphrates River, including a very important battle at Megiddo, which, if that sounds familiar to you, Megiddo was a very famous ancient world battle site. And kind of an interesting, fun fact, I guess. I normally say this in class, but we're doing these videos instead. Megiddo, as a famous battle site, shows up in the Bible. In fact, it's the battle site of the ultimate battle, the final battle between good and evil. And we call that battle in English Armageddon, Armageddon, right? It's from the word Megiddo. It's from this battle site, this ancient site where many wars were fought, that we get the word Armageddon, right? Because that's literally where it comes from, that part of the world. So I just found it interesting. I think that's an interesting little fun fact, and I like to mention it there. So Hatshepsut, very important, right? Conquering. This is the theme of the new kingdom, right? If we talked about the theme as pyramids in the old kingdom, Hyksos in the middle, the new kingdom is all about the empire, right? Expanding and controlling more territory. That is the driving force behind the new kingdom. And that leads to probably the pharaoh outside of Tut and Cleopatra, whose name you've heard of before, and that's this guy. And you might be saying, Mr. Veerling, there's 4 people there, or at least there were 4 statues there. Well, that's all the same guy. That is the temple of Abu Simbel, which is located pretty far south along the Nile, carved into the side of a mountain. And the pharaoh who created this was so proud of his accomplishments that he decided to have himself depicted on the side, sitting on his throne 4 times. And you can see that over, a few millennia, that it's held up pretty good, right? We have the one that's pretty much destroyed, and one of the guys has lost his beard, but the other 2 look like they're in pretty good condition. And I like using this photo because it has, tourists there, so you get a sense of just how big and monumental this was. And the person who created this was Ramses. Ramses II. He was the guy who fought the Hittites at Kadesh. He was mentioned in the Bible. Ramses II is probably the most well-known Egyptian pharaoh of the New Kingdom. And this is his mummy. That's the image we're looking at. I probably should have started with that. Who's this weird guy on the screen? That's his mummy. That's his mummy now. That's his body now. And I want you to take a look at this, and we'll come back to Egyptian mummification later, I promise. But look at the fact that this guy has been dead for 3,500 years, right? And he still has hair, right? He still has eyelids. He still has skin. His ear is still there, right? Ears are just cartilage. They usually go away pretty quickly. He's still got his skin. He still has his bones. He still has his hair. His nose is still there, right? Nose is just cartilage too. The fact that he's this well preserved shows you how impressive Egyptian mummification was, right? This process of preserving the dead that the Egyptians discovered really was remarkable, right? The fact that we could take this picture of Ramses II, right? This is what he looked like, right? This is him, guys. This is remarkable that we're able to even talk about this. But what were his accomplishments? Okay, right? It's his body surviving was not his accomplishment, right? That's the accomplishment of the people who did the mummification and the priests and all those people who were involved in that process. But Ramses' accomplishments was, yes, he fought the battle at Kadesh, and as we know, he lost that battle, even though he said he won. But we do know that he expanded farther south into Nubia, right? Which, if you remember from our notes before, Nubia is that really gold-rich region in the south. And he used all of the gold that was conquered from there to pay his army, right? He was considered one of the better pharaohs because of how well he treated, the people in his army and stuff like that. And it's really after Ramses comes into play here that the Nubians in modern-day Sudan start embracing Egyptian culture, and they kind of create all these mini pyramids and mini obelisks, which are like the Washington Monument looking kinds of things, which is very Egyptian. And when I say mini, I mean they're like 10 feet instead of 100 feet tall. But it's interesting that you can see kind of this play on Egyptian culture that the Nubian people started embracing really after Ramses II. So you can see this kind of example of cultural diffusion, right? That these ideas start spreading throughout the Nile region as a whole, as opposed to just staying north in Egypt. But really, after Ramses II, the New Kingdom starts to decline. In fact, it really ends with him. The New Kingdom the empire becomes too big. The Hittites win at Kadesh. They start losing territory left and right, and eventually the New Kingdom declines. And the reason why I've been harping so much on the fact that that the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms are what historians break Egyptian history down into is because just because the New Kingdom has ended doesn't mean that that's the end of Egyptian history, right? So in fact, we can look at it this way. The last pharaoh of the New Kingdom was Ramses II, right? He was the last pharaoh of the New Kingdom. But the last pharaoh of Egypt was Cleopatra, right? So the rule of the pharaoh and rule of Egyptian history expands far beyond Ramses, right? We're talking another 1,000 years or more beyond Ramses. But that characteristic, that historical epoch, right, if we can use some of our terms, really just lasts for when Egypt was building its empire, right? So from the removal of the Hyksos, there's another intermediary period. Then the New Kingdom really starts with the expansion of Egypt. That continues to Ramses, and then they start to lose some of that territory, and that's when we draw that line with that's where the New Kingdom ends. But Cleopatra, if you don't know, she lost Egypt to Rome. But before that, Egypt was taken over after Ramses. Egypt was taken over by the Assyrians, followed by the Persians, followed by the Greeks with Alexander, and then finally by the Romans. And Cleopatra is a really interesting historical person too, and we'll get more into her, history and stuff a little bit later. But I think it's always fun to actually. This video is going on way too long. I'm sorry, guys. We'll call it quits here. We'll talk about Cleopatra next time we're together in class, just a little bit, and then we'll get started on talking about Egyptian mythology, right? Because their religious beliefs and practices are really interesting and important here. So in this video, we talked about all things New Kingdom. We talked about the main characteristic of the New Kingdom, which was empire, right? So if we're putting this in a little graphic organizer, the Old Kingdom equals pyramids, the Middle Kingdom equals Hyksos, the New Kingdom equals empire. We talked about Thutmose III expanding Egypt to the largest territory it had. And most importantly in this video, we talked about Hatshepsut, the first recorded evidence of a female pharaoh in Egyptian history, who ruled for over 20 years, expanded the territory, and took her rightful claim as pharaoh. Something that her predecessors, people who came after her, did not really like, which is why I have to preface all of this with saying the one that we have evidence of. We'll talk more about that next time we're together as well. So this video, all things New Kingdom. Let me know if you guys have any questions, and I will see you soon.